Hi there! In this episode of Echoes of Time, we are going to learn about Tartar. But before we do that, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more historical tales from all across the world. The word Tartar has been used to describe several regions throughout history. Today, it is sometimes used to refer to Central Asia, but it was previously used to describe the vast Eurasian steppes north of China. The Tarim Basin and Tarim Desert are also named after the reason. In this video, though, we will be focusing on the region which Europeans refer to as Tartary between the 17th and 19th centuries. This region was located east of Poland in Russia, west of northern China, and south of Siberia. The area was mostly flat, dry grassland, and was inhabited by various nomadic Turkic peoples. The term Tartar itself was a self-identifier for these people. They called themselves Tatar, and this was an exonym given to them by the Chinese, Russians, and others. The exact origin of the name is unknown, but it probably derived from one of the Turkic languages. Some scholars believe it came from the Kipchak language and means to strike with the fist. Others believe it comes from the name of a group of people who lived in the area called the Tatars. As mentioned earlier, the region was home to several different groups of people, including the Mongols, the Siberian Tatars, and others. For most of its existence, it was not a unified region, but rather a collection of loosely connected tribes and groups. Because of this, there really isn't a definitive start date for the region. But historians generally agree that it rose to prominence in the 6th century CE, when the Mongol Empire stretched through much of the area. Under the Mongols, the region became known as the Northern Steppe. It was during this time that many of the nomadic groups found there would develop their distinct cultures. When the Mongols eventually split into several different groups, the northern steppes were broken up and would remain fragmented for many years. Between the 13th and 15th centuries, the area was controlled by several different groups, including the Golden Horde, the Chagatai Khanate, and the Togoluk Khanate. Eventually, though, the area came under the control of the Russian Empire. However, despite being ruled over by the Russians, the nomadic people continued to live largely independent lives on the steppes. The Russian influence in the area grew significantly in the 18th century after Peter the Great conquered parts of southern Russia. Many Swedish and German mercenaries who had fought for the Russians during the Great Northern War settled in the area and brought with them new technologies and ideas. The capital city of Kazan became an important center for trade and agriculture. The Volga Tatars, who had converted to Islam earlier in the century, were allowed to keep their religion and were integrated into the Russian Empire. During this time period, the boundaries of what constituted Tartary fluctuated quite a bit. Generally speaking, the western boundary was along the Dnieper River, and the eastern boundary was along the Ob. The northern boundary started at the mouth of the Obi River and followed the Ural River south until it reached the Caspian Sea. From there, it followed the course of the Volga River to its source, and then followed the watershed that separated the Volga and Don rivers. The southern boundary of Tartary roughly followed the watersheds that separated it from China and Persia. Despite the fluctuating borders, the region was generally considered to be a part of Russia. However, the Russians did not have much control over the area because of the lack of infrastructure and the large distances involved. As such, The region was often left to govern itself, which led to a great deal of autonomy for the nomadic people. The Russian Empire continued to grow throughout the 19th century and eventually encompassed all of the territory of Tartary. However, the region continued to be known as Tartary until the early 20th century. During this time, the region was mostly populated by nomads who lived in yurts and traveled with their animals. Their way of life was deeply rooted in tradition, and they were largely agriculture was limited to small settlements along the rivers, and the majority of food was obtained through hunting and gathering. It wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. However, there were several conflicts between the nomadic people and the Russians during this time period. For example, in 1722, Peter the Great led a campaign against the Crimean Tatars after they raided the Russian border. This campaign resulted in the destruction of many Tatar villages and the deportation of many Tatars to Siberia. Similarly, in 1805, a group of Kalmyk Tatars revolted against Russian rule, but were ultimately defeated and forced to flee to Mongolia. These conflicts were a result of the tensions that existed between the two groups. The nomadic people felt that their way of life was under threat from the Russians, and they resisted as such. The Russians, in turn, wanted to assert their dominance in the region and bring the nomads under their control. Aside from these conflicts, the region of Tartary was relatively peaceful and stable. The nomadic people were able to maintain their way of life for many years, and the Russians were able to expand their empire without much interference from the Tartars. This stability came to an end. However, in the early 20th century, with the Russian Revolution, the revolution and the subsequent Russian Civil War caused a great deal of upheaval in the region. Many Tatars fought on the side of the White Army against the Bolsheviks, but the Bolsheviks eventually won the war and came to power in Russia. The Bolsheviks' takeover of Russia had a profound impact on the region of Tartary. The nomadic people were no longer able to live according to their traditions, and the vast stretches of grassland that had defined the region for centuries were now seen as wasted land. The Bolsheviks began to implement policies aimed at collectivizing agriculture and industrializing the region. This, of course, did not go over well with the nomadic people who had lived in the area for generations. In response to the Bolshevik policies, many Tartars fled to China and Mongolia. Those who stayed behind were subjected to forced collectivization and the destruction of their traditional way of life. With the rise of the Soviet Union, the region was divided between several different republics, namely the Russian SSR, the Kazakh ASSR, the Kyrgyz ASSR, the Mongolian People's Republic, and the Tuva ASSR. Over time, the memory of Tartary faded, and the region was no longer known by that name. Instead, it became known as the Eurasian Steppe, or simply Siberia. Today, the area is mostly used for grazing livestock and growing crops such as wheat and barley. The legacy of the nomadic people who once lived there is still visible in the landscape. However, with many of their burial grounds and other artifacts still remaining in the region. So what can we learn from the history of Tartary? For one, it shows us the importance of cultural preservation. The nomadic people of Tartary were able to maintain their way of life for many years, even in the face of outside pressures. However, when their culture was ultimately destroyed, it was a great loss for all of humanity. Additionally, it shows us the importance of understanding different cultures. The nomadic people of Tartary were very different from the Russians, but that did not mean that they were inferior. In fact, they had a rich and vibrant culture that had developed over many centuries. Finally, it shows us the importance of peace and stability. When Tartary was relatively peaceful and stable, its people were able to thrive. However, when the region was caught up in the Russian Revolution and the Russian Civil War, their way of life was destroyed. That's all for this episode. What did you think about Tartary? Did you know about it before watching this video? Let me know in the comments down below. Be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more videos. And as always, thanks for watching.